So today I'm going to talk about making great apps. My experience is with Windows 8, Windows Phone 7, soon to be Windows Phone 8, and iOS. And what I thought I'd do today is bring you through the elements of a good Windows 8 app. But in a lot of these cases, you can always give these examples that are quite sort of static and quite boring. And there are case studies out there that Microsoft have provided, which are great material, but at the same time, they're not real. So what I decided to do today was I actually decided to go through some real apps. And these apps actually exist right now on iOS and on Windows 8. And again, this isn't obviously about necessarily saying which one is better. It's more about just showing the differences between the platforms and showing that in some cases there are similarities, in some cases there are differences. So from a design point of view, you can adapt what you know, or you can basically go crazy and develop something completely different. So up first, we're going to talk about the content, which also is a navigation in a lot of ways for a Windows 8 app. And to do that, we're going to, first of all, bring in one of the main principles of Windows 8, which is content before Chrome, which is really just a simple way of saying that whereas you might have had an iPad app which has content laid out and buttons and things like that, we kind of want to get most of those out of the way and just leave the content on its own to kind of speak for itself and allow the user to kind of to tap and explore and find out how the app works. So to do that, we're going to look at quickly. We're going to look at the Skyscanner app. So this is just a screenshot from the iPad version of the app. Now, again, Skyscanner app is actually a very nice app, very good example on a lot of platforms. But essentially, what they've done here, again, works perfectly fine on iOS. You can kind of see the toolbars and the various buttons, and of course, we have the offers off onto the left-hand side, which it tries to sort of figure out based on where you are. And again, that works perfectly fine. But in the case of Windows 8, what you would basically do is you would remove most of the buttons and all the toolbars and things like that you would see, and you're left with that. Now again, that still provides the primary function. We can search for our flights and so on, and you'll also notice then that there's a hint off to the right-hand side there, which is your previous search history. So again, if I just go back very quickly, so we should see there the iPad version, and then onto the Windows 8 version. And from a branding point of view, they're very similar. The logo's there, they've kept their colors, they have the clouds at the bottom, which, although I'm not kind of demoing the app, when you move the app around with your hand, there's kind of parallax scrolling going on with the clouds, which is basically a very, very nice experience. So one of the other main features, again, is about flattening the navigation. And this comes into play when you have an iPad app and you're somewhat limited by space. So what you do is you start to hide things in subpages or even kind of drop-down menus. So in the case of the MTV News app here, they have their main article here and their article selection here, but you'll notice buttons up the top for galleries and videos, and they even have kind of social networking links up at the top right. So again, in the Metro sense, what we do is, well, I can say Metro because I'm not Microsoft. In a Windows 8 way, what we would do is we would look at that and we really just want to take the content that they've broken into multiple pages and essentially put it onto a big, gigantic canvas, in a sense, that you can use to explore. So if we look at the Windows 8 version of that app, they've essentially done that, and it's incredibly visual. And of course, all of these images here are the news, or at least it was the news yesterday. I'm sure it's very different now. And you can explore that, and of course, again, you get the hint of the content off the right-hand side. So the person then, if they're using a tablet, they're going to start swiping over, and they're going to see more. And it's a great way to experience lots of forms of news and things like that, which of course MTV and things like that are very, very visual. So it works very, very well. And then the other thing which is very important is semantic zoom, because in flattening the navigation, what you're essentially doing is you're taking what could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages worth of information, and you're condensing them onto one big canvas that the person exploring. And of course, you may kind of think, well, isn't that a bit daunting for users? So semantic zoom is kind of their answer to that, and that allows you to get a sort of an aerial view of your data. So in the case of the Sky News, they have their grid layout of all of their stories, and then all I simply do is I pinch, and it actually goes and shows me the categories instead. So if there's a particular thing, if there's politics or world news or something like that I want to look at, if I then just basically tap on that, that then will zoom back down into the content and bring me to the relevant area, which is very handy. Next, and I am going through this presentation a little bit quicker than I would have thought because we're trying to kind of make up time. So apologies if it's a bit fast. If you have questions and things like that, it's probably best to ask me later. I will be around. Commands and actions. So in designing your app for Windows 8, again, because you're making your content the key focus of the app. Generally, what you also want to do, and what you'll see with most of the apps, is that all of their buttons are essentially hidden. But of course, buttons, commands are completely necessary to do work in all the various apps. So in the case of Windows 8, that just takes the form of the app bar. Now, the app bar, there's two of them. There's the top app bar and then the bottom app bar. And essentially, the bottom one is where all of the commands go and the buttons go. And the general rule for this, which we'll see some examples now in a second, is on the right-hand side, they're more for sort of global commands. So they're commands that may be more persistent throughout the app, throughout lots of pages. Whereas the commands on the left-hand side are more to do with the context of what you're doing right now. So if you've selected a picture, which we'll see in a second, it allows you to do things with that picture. Whereas on the right-hand side there, I don't know, it could be some global feature example that I can't think of right now. And then there's the top nav bar, which is all about navigation, which is best illustrated by an actual example, which I'll show you in a second. So first of all, I will show you this is the Skydrive app. So like lots of people, my Skydrive is full of cats. And this, again, illustrates a few points. One is that content is first. So when we look at this, all you're seeing is your pictures. There's nothing else. It roughly shows you what application you're in, and it's my Skydrive, and there's some pictures. If I tap on those pictures, I will obviously view them. But if I want to delete them because I have too many pictures of cats, or I want to do some kind of operations, I can simply swipe up from the bottom of the screen to reveal the app bar. And which, again, brings up those sort of global commands I was talking about. So again, you can, given it SkyDrive and there's folders and files and so on, you can create new folders and upload new pictures and things like that. Now, of course, looking at those pictures of cats, if my cat wasn't too happy about those pictures and I wanted to get rid of some of them, all I simply do is you basically swipe down on the individual images that you want to select. And then on the left-hand side, on the app bar, the context-sensitive icons appear. And then that allows you to, in my case, delete the photos. So again, that's the app bar. And when you get a chance, because there are a lot of tablets around today, when you get a chance to actually play around with Windows 8, you'll notice when you either swipe down from the bottom or the top, it actually doesn't matter, the app bars will become visible. You'll see that there's basically lots of commands there and lots of features to discover about certain apps. The other kind of app bar, which we don't see very many of, but this will depend on what kind of app you have, is the top app bar, which is mainly for navigation. So generally what we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing two kinds of apps. One is full of content and has lots of things to tap on and many pages and lots of things to explore, and you're basically going back and forth and so on all the time. But there are other kinds of apps, and Windows 8 itself has a few of them. This is the Bing Travel app, where it kind of has a few pages, but they're not really joined together, and you're not going to go from A to B to C. You're just the pages are sort of they're just separate. There's no link between them. So this is where the app bar, the navigation at the top, becomes very useful. So it allows a user to skip around the app very quickly. Or, of course, someone can make the argument that if your application has a lot of sections and some of them are more popular than others, that the navigation at the top would allow them to skip between them, which it pretty much does here as well. So, and then a second example of that is the weather app as well, which again allows you to very quickly kind of add new cities, so you can basically see if there's actually sunshine somewhere else other than here. And then the app bar down the bottom, which you can't see because of the color, because it's kind of blue on blue, and we have blue lighting, which is now great for these slides. But the other thing as well, that just in case, because when you read the documentation and you read the kind of the design guidelines for Windows 8, it is sometimes hard to know, well, can I use this in conjunction with that? And this is basically a screenshot of Internet Explorer 10 on Windows 8. And the question does arise sometimes, well, can you use both forms of navigation at the same time? And the simple answer to that is yes. So the previous application, which was the weather app, that actually uses both. And then Internet Explorer uses it uses it for basically tabular navigation, switching between the tabs in IE10. Then of course you have your regular sort of browsing controls, refresh, home, URL, things like that at the bottom. So these can be customized quite heavily. And both the design templates give you examples of these, and then programmatically, obviously there's a number of developers here, there are sample projects which give you all forms of various app bars to play around with. And a side note as well, which is quite nice, is the little icons that you get to choose. Windows 8 comes with a whole load to choose from, but they're actually small little fonts. They're all contained in a basically kind of a glyph font that you can access, which means you get a whole load of them for free. They're all in one place, and they scale very nicely across different resolutions, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. One of the things that was mentioned earlier, I think, by Bill was this notion of, we have the guidelines and we follow the guidelines, but what about going outside the guidelines? What about doing other things? Can I stray from the guidelines? And of course you can. And we saw this with iOS as well in the early days, both on the iPhone and the iPad, that they have their guidelines, they have their standard built-in apps, and over time people have learned to make their own custom controls on those devices. If you look at either Instagram or the Facebook app, they have very custom controls. They're not standard and they're custom, but they're very good, and to some they're relatively intuitive. So we're already starting to see that, and even though it's in early days, we're already starting to see that on Windows 8. So in this example here, it's pretty straightforward. This is just the results from searching for some flights. But you'll notice that there's buttons up in the top right. Now, if you were to read the guidelines and you had to follow them really strictly, you kind of go, well, that should really be a button bar. But what they decided to do, the developers with Skyscanner, they basically decided to make their own little control, which probably wasn't too much work, but they know what they're doing and it was still nice. So what I can do simply is when I actually tap on the filter, it basically kind of grays out the screen. And then it reveals the particular options for what I've tapped and allows me to refine my results list. And again, they could have done this with an app bar, and in fact, a lot of the standard apps do, but they've already started to vary a little bit and come up with their own controls. And so it just gives you an idea of what people are already doing, which is very nice. And of course, all this stuff is design-led. So Skyscanner is a very nice app because it's designed, and because it's designed very well, and it features very nice kind of subtle animations here and there. So the next bits that, again, Windows 8 provides and that you can implement in your app relatively easily is search and share, or the search and share contracts. So in the case of the MTV app on the iPad, it doesn't appear to have any search feature that I could find. Obviously, normally in a kind of an iOS sense, you'd have some kind of text box, maybe in the top right. You would tap on that would allow you to search. That's not there. That's fine. They decided not to do that. Who knows? They may add it later. That's perfectly fine. But on the Windows 8 version, possibly because it was very easy to implement, they've added in basically kind of a sort of a local search. Now, what this actually does is when I search, it will go and search the kind of the current content within the app. So, because I'm sure there are fans of either Justin Bieber or Justin Timberlake somewhere, when you search for that, you can kind of go and get all the headlines or related stuff to that. And of course, the search will search the current app that's running. So when I'm in the MTV app and I do a search, it's going to search the MTV app. But if I decide that I want to just go and do a search in Internet Explorer and see what comes up, you can always scroll down the list and then tap, and that will go into Internet Explorer instead and conduct your search there. And then the next bit was sharing. And again, the Sky News app, particularly actually on the iPad, is extremely well made. Very, very nice. And there's a couple of ways of viewing your data. And of course, when you look at this is also a grid-based layout. So it kind of stands to reason that their app on the iPad or their app on Windows 8 looks similar. But in the case of sharing, I couldn't find any sharing option. So you can view all the content. That's great. But of course, if you know someone in the UK at the moment and there's all reports of floods and things like that, and you want to email an article to them, I don't know, you'd probably have to take a screenshot or something and send it to them. So there's no built-in sort of sharing that I could find. Whereas again, on Windows 8, it's very easy to do. Essentially, what's happening is you have the article here. What all the developer really does is they write a sort of a description into the app, essentially, of what the app will share. In this case, it's going to be probably a couple of pictures, maybe one or more pictures, some text, and a link. And then Windows 8 kind of takes note of that. And then when you swipe out from the right-hand side and you say share, it then goes and has a look on the system and says, what apps support that kind of content? So what apps support a picture, a link, and some text? And of course, obviously, we have things like Mail. MetroTwit is a Twitter client. The People one, I'm not too sure about that one, because that's a funny one. It must like fill up your contacts or something with news. I don't know how that works. And of course, Skydrive, so you can put it over to Skydrive. So in that case, all I simply needed to do was tap on the Mail, and it goes and opens the Mail client, which is designed to run in this sort of this what's called a share target mode, which essentially is this mini mode where it accepts the information coming from another app, and then it lays it out, and then I can simply tap the button up there to send, and it's done. And that doesn't take me away from my current app or anything like that. It literally, if I tap that, you get a little spinny icon, it would say sent, and then that dialog will basically disappear, and you'd be able to continue looking at the news. The next feature, which is there's a couple of features here actually, which are very important, especially as time goes by and we get bigger in screens and stuff, is snap and scale. So snap and scale, it's about designing for different screens because obviously PCs, as we know them at the moment, have many different types of screen types. And although we're seeing the initial Windows 8 tablets having relatively standard screens, they'll probably only get higher resolution over time. And I'm sure there are people here who have maybe 24-inch, 27-inch monitors. And of course, we've even seen with the iPad, we have Retina Displays, which are 2,500 by 1,500. So they're much higher than this base resolution of 1366 by 768. So with all of this, it's very important to do a few things. And Visual Studio, from the development side, and I suppose from the design side as well, with the templates, Visual Studio makes it somewhat easier to test and to cope with all these different situations. So in the case of, let me go into another one. Actually, that's Snap View. I'll go into that in a second. In the case of larger displays with larger resolutions, one of the nice things is your controls will basically, depending on what kind of control you use, they will assist you. So you'll see a lot of these grid layouts. Those grid layouts, normally what they'll do is they'll simply occupy 100% of the screen, and they'll actually expand. And that's pretty handy. So when it comes to laying out content like that, you don't have to worry about, can I only fit 4 lines, can I fit 6? You simply give the grid a particular amount of space, and then you give it a number of items, and it will reflow the items. And that has a couple of advantages, which I'll show you later on with Portrait. But for the moment, what it means is that when you're simply running your app on a standard sort of lower resolution display, and then of course the higher, larger resolution displays of tomorrow, your application can reflow, or at least it's very, very straightforward to add that. Snap View, which I'll go into a second, is actually required because obviously there are portions of this which are not. So Portrait, which I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute, Portrait's not required. So there are apps on the iPad, for example, that don't support I'll say landscape, and you can do that. You can simply, when you're creating your project, you can simply say, I'm actually not going to support that orientation. That's perfectly fine. I'll go with one instead. But Snap View is required. So Snap View, again, if you haven't already seen Windows 8 running and you haven't already tried this, Snap View is essentially a mini version of your app. And in most cases, what we've seen is most apps are fully featured when they run in Snap View, but it's just that the content is somewhat condensed. So in the case of the Sky News app there, it allows you to access all of its content. So instead of having a large grid that goes off left to right, you just have this kind of smaller list that goes top to bottom. And then you can tap on that, and it will again display the story in a sort of a condensed manner. And from a technical point of view, what we normally see people doing is when you're basically building your pages and designing your pages, you will generally have maybe 2 sets of controls within a page. And when you go into Snap View, you essentially hide one and display the other. That seems to be the common factor. But it's somewhat, if anyone has done either designing or development in iOS, it's a similar situation when we're dealing with orientation. You have the notion that you can use your existing view and just make it resize, or you can simply actually swap in and out completely different views. So there are different options there. Visual Studio comes with templates which give examples of both Snap View and allowing the content to reflow. So again, if you haven't had a look at this stuff already, I'd recommend having a look at kind of the standard templates within Visual Studio 2012. Again, in the case of MTV News with their Snap View, it's a similar thing. They've basically kind of condensed their content. It's still visual, but it ends up being a big list which you can scroll through, which is, again, gives a nice experience. And of course, at any time, that person can decide that they're sick of looking at the weather, and we all know it's going to probably rain again soon. So what you can do is you can just put your hand there, grab the bar, and swipe over, and then that app becomes full screen again. So you can actually, if you saw there's Justin Timberlake, so if we're interested in seeing what he's doing, you can just swipe that over and then tap on the article and read it. So before I mentioned about the the portrait view. I think at the moment it kind of appears that landscape is the more popular form factor when people are using these devices, but that's again no reason not to support the sort of the portrait orientation as well. So in this case, we have the Sky News app, and they've benefited from the fact that they're using one of the built-in controls, which is called the grid view. And what they've simply done is the grid view, whether it's in landscape or portrait, occupies pretty much 100% of the screen, except for their logo. And what they do is they just feed the grid a number of items. And then all that's really happening here is when the tablet reorientates to portrait, the grid detects that and then reflows. So from a programming point of view, you actually wouldn't really have to do anything for that. Now, obviously, you can, and the Sky Scanner app here on the right is a good example of that. So although it visually doesn't look very much different, when you actually see it in motion, they basically have gone for sort of a custom approach. So things like they've actually gone for what nearly looks like a kind of a standard app bar down the bottom, but I think it works a little bit differently. So again, you can, depending on your timeline and your design, all these kinds of things, you can make these decisions to sort of using the built-in controls and get the free stuff, or you can go the kind of the custom route, which is a little bit more work, but again, you can see it can sometimes look very, very nice. The next one I'll go on to, which again I'm going to kind of zip through, is pixel density. So I would hope that a lot of people are aware of the fact that with iPhones and iPads we have Retina Displays, which essentially means that there's sort of 4 times the pixel density. And what that means to developers is that, well, first of all, you get certain elements that are resized for free. And that's actually true in Windows 8 as well. But essentially, when it comes to images, you have to produce multiple images. So on iOS and on the iPad, you end up with 2 sizes, which is fine. I mean, it's a little bit more work, but people get used to it, and some people design at the higher resolution and scale down and so on. But it's something to keep in mind because some of the initial devices that have already been announced by Samsung, Asus, Acer, Dell, and so on. What happens is we're seeing tablets which are around a similar size, so say 9, 10, 11 inches, but the resolutions go from the base resolution, the 1336 by 768, all the way up to 1080p. Now, if you haven't worked with multiple resolutions before, 1080p on a 10-inch tablet, everything's very, very small. So what basically happens in that instance is that Windows 8 runs everything scaled up. So the percentages, which are going to list here, are because there are 3 scales: 100%, 140, and 180. So again, the 180, I don't believe there are any devices announced just yet that support that, but that wouldn't surprise me in the next few months if we see some. But essentially, that's the super, super, super high resolution. That's actually pretty much like the Retina display on the iPad. Extremely high. 253 dpi, so everything is super, super small. So because of that, what Windows 8 does is it scales everything up. So it scales up the UI elements that you get. They're scaled up for free, and they're all done. They become sort of sharper. The text becomes sharper, but it's up to the developer to then, or the developer and the designer to then specify higher quality, larger images essentially for the different displays. From a programmatical point of view, it works somewhat similar, at least from a local storage point of view, with images. So what happens is your app will simply request an image name, and the OS can then essentially add a prefix onto that to basically say 100%, 140%, or 180%. So again, from a coding point of view, it doesn't mean you have to go in and add, 3 sets of conditional loadings for every single image. So, which is kind of handy. But again, there are code examples for this. What has been mentioned earlier a few times already is design.windows.com and dev.windows.com. And of course, given that I kind of handle a lot of developer stuff, dev.windows.com has essentially samples for all of the API stuff. So whenever someone talks about local storage, or they talk about loading images and scaling and all that kinds of stuff, you can actually search on the site for that. And more than likely, there will be some kind of code sample there that gives you a good idea of how to use that particular API. And then I think final section, so I'm flying through this nearly, is live tiles and notifications. So, and again, a lot of this is sort of unique to Windows 8. So live tiles, we've already seen Windows 8 being demoed a few times now. You can see the various start screens. I unfortunately just have this kind of boring static image which has no animation or anything on it, but it's supposed to just show you that the live tiles can be designed in many different ways, from displaying simple text imagery to showing a full picture, and a little bit of technical detail. I think the minimum time or the fastest time you can update them is every 5 minutes, but it's generally not a good idea to do that, because although live tiles are great and they show information, they are considered passive, which means that a person is more than likely either not using their computer or in an app. So if you're updating every 5 minutes, they're going to be missing most of your updates. We're kind of seeing so far is with news apps and things like that, every hour, every 2 or 3 hours is perfectly fine. And also in terms of what you can show, programmatically, those are images. So for the developers, there are APIs there that essentially generate the image, and then you can have you fire up to 5 images that get put onto sort of a stack that rotates, and then the operating system handles that. But live tiles, again, if they suit your app, use them. They're very easy to, they're actually relatively easy to implement. And again, there's a lot of examples there on how to do that. And it's very nice. They're very, very nice to see a kind of an active start screen. The other one as well, which again you have on Android and you have on iOS, is notifications. So there's 2 kinds of notifications. Local, which means that your app has some kind of, timer or event in it, and it just goes and does a notification about something. The other one is push notification. And the reason why you'd use potentially push notifications is, before I said about the tiles, that maybe there's stuff on the tiles that you're showing, but the user won't see it because maybe they're in an app. But with notifications, they appear above everything else. So, if you have a kind of an app that has some kind of urgent information it needs to show, notifications are the way to do that. And much like what Apple do, Microsoft have essentially their own push notification server. So you write some kind of app or some kind of web app that pushes to that in turn gets pushed to the app. And again, there's at least 2 or 3 examples, I think, of code that does that if you wanted to test that and so on. But it's, again, if you're familiar, if you've gone through that with iOS, it's similar. And then the next one, which you don't see too much of, but it's quite nice. And actually, this features Cocktail Flow, which I'm sure you'll hear a lot about later. And it's a gorgeous app. It looks very nice, and it features a ton of animation and very, very well made. But I just wanted to demonstrate one small feature, which is simply that, if you're, again, it's an application that's full of drinks, basically. And say, I have the mojito, and let's pretend I like making mojitos a lot. Instead of potentially having to go into an app and search around and go through 2 or 3 pages of navigation, if there is a particular page in an app that you like and you want to revisit, you can always pin it to the start. And again, from a developer point of view, that's very, very easy to add. And for a user, I think the best example I had, I suppose probably because I've developed an app in this area, is if you have, for example, a public transport app, and you have a favorite bus stop or a favorite station or something like that. And you don't necessarily need to go into the app. You know that there's just 2 stops that you use every day. Why not just pin those 2 stops directly to the start screen? And basically that's what you can do. So in this case, I can simply now just tap the mojito icon and it goes straight to the mojito recipe, as opposed to having to potentially go through 2 or 3 steps. But that's available on Windows 8 and of course Windows Phone, and it's a unique factor on Windows 8, as well as the live tiles itself. So to recap over what I flew through, Windows 8 apps are about putting the content first. And as others have mentioned, and it's very true, the content in a lot of ways is the navigation. And any kind of actions or things like that, you generally hide. So you hide the buttons, and you only show them when they're necessary or when the person is going to want some kind of context-relevant action. And then, of course, search and share, again, they've been mentioned, and you'll probably see them be mentioned a few times again already. And then, of course, Snap View, which you actually have to implement. That is a feature. You will actually fail certification if you don't do that. But then please do test when it comes to scaling and rotation. Please do test those things. The simulator can do that. And of course, live tiles, notifications, which are great, and pin to start if that's suitable in your app. And I think that's it. Thank you.